speaker. Just we are going to have a little bit of technical change. When you ask questions now, I don't have to run around with this one. It's going to be a microphone on the camera, which is working better, but it means that you have to speak a bit loud when you ask the questions. Okay? Perfect. So, Johanna Ulmanen, who is Research Associate here at SCI, you will give a presentation on integrating climate adaptation concerns in Swedish forestry policy. So, Johanna, please.
Thank you. How does it work?
Oh, this is.
Okay. All right. Welcome everyone after a nice lunch outside in the sun. This is a research that is part of a bigger project, a big program called Mistra-SWECIA, which looks at climate change, climate effects and adaptation. And we have some colleagues here today as well, as I can see in the audience. My presentation will be somewhat different. I will focus very much on a case study on the Swedish forestry sector and how this sector has coped with this adaptation issue so far. So to start off, the forest industry, why I'm looking on the forest industry, or why we at the program are looking at the forestry industry, is because it's a big sector in Sweden. It's a very important industrial sector, and when it comes to climate change and the effects that will have, we expect, being a northern country, we expect that the production will increase because of warmer weather and wetter weather. But on the other hand, there is also negative effects. We are afraid of increased pests and vermins, and also of windfalls due to storms. So the thing with the forest sector is also that it takes a long time. You have to plan ahead, because if you plant a tree today, it takes 70 years for it to become mature for logging. So that's why this becomes an urgent question, that you have to start thinking about climate adaptation, if we are soon at least. So it's not like the agricultural sector. The interesting fact is that this kind of arguments about climate adaptation, it came up in the scientific sector, in scientific arena, in the 1990s, but still today there is actually no real plan or strategy, and this is why I'm looking at this research and trying to look at the policy process. So what I end up with, the aim of this study, is to gain insight in the process of integrating climate adaptation in the Swedish forestry policy. And the research question is, what are the institutional barriers and opportunities for integrating climate adaptation in the Swedish forestry policy? And when I look at the institutions, I don't think of organizations. I'm a sociologist. So I'm looking at some different aspects, not the organization, but more about the actual formal rules, regulations, and written rules, as well as informal issues like norms and values and the way we see problems and deal with them in everyday life. So it's a wider concept. So you could see, if you drive a car, you have certain rules regulating that you should drive on the right-hand side and stop on a red light. But if you walk at the pavement, there might not be so many formal rules when you walk along, but you still keep to the right, you still have some courtesy with the people that you pass and so on. So there's a lot of informal things and routines that we have also in the forestry sector that are not written down. And to detect these kind of institutions, I'm using a frame analysis, and especially for these informal institutions, and know what kind of rules they have in this forestry sector and what limits their opportunity to think about adaptation problem, climate change effects and climate adaptation solutions. I also look at actors' frames, meaning the way different actor groups, see or position themselves in a debate, both the way they think about their reality, but also more strategic ways of dealing with this question of climate adaptation. And without a policy change, a policy process involves change, and then you need to also change the way you see problems, the way you frame your reality outside. So that's why you have to study the process of reframing, or how the actors change the perspective. And that we do by learning. So that's why I also have a focus on learning processes in this study of the climate adaptation debate, and how this process is or is not integrated in policy. I will get back to single and double loop learning later in my analysis. Brief explanation of my method. The case is climate adaptation policy in the forestry sector, and I've been looking on different policy documents. I've been doing a content analysis, and I've been doing interviews, and some of them I will get back to when I present my results. So, for instance, this content analysis, then I looked into a database on Swedish newspapers to just see how much articles are about forest and production, for instance, the curve on top, forest issues and mitigations, only hit words, looking in this database to see what the debate is about. If there's a lot of hits on an issue, it shows that this is a debate, or this is discussed in society. Negative or positive, I don't know, but at least it's an issue. So you see forest and mitigation issues, forest and biodiversity, and forest and climate adaptation. As you can see, climate adaptation is not really a hot topic to discuss in Swedish media. And it kind of shows that there are more important issues. And it's maybe not so surprising, because Swedish forestry is very production-oriented. So everything that is reported in media about the forest is usually something to do with production, or the industry, also production of things, wooden things and so on. And if you look at mitigation and biodiversity, these kind of issues have been longer on the policy agenda. They have been discussed more widely, and that also is shown very much in this graph, that these kind of issues are more important or more popular to discuss than, for instance, climate adaptation. I won't go in so much into the details of this, but it's interesting to note that there's at least a growth from 2005 till 2007. So and then it stays kind of stable with the peaks in 2007 and 2009. So how can we understand this, or at least now when we get some perspective? Just to reflect on, this is a very thick slide with different things, but some of the policy developments that have been dealing with adaptation, climate adaptation in the forestry sector, shows that there were some seminars, and there were primarily scientists taking up this issue in the 90s, that we need to look into this issue. It's important for the forestry sector to look into the risks and the opportunities, and how to deal with them, and how we can plan for the future. And it's especially the Royal Society for Agriculture and Forestry, that I have abbreviated with the Swedish abbreviation KSLA, sorry, it should be the other way around, that gives some space for this debate in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And
for those who are not familiar with KSLA, could you just say what it is in English?
Yes, I try to right now. The Royal Society of now I lost my name. Royal Academy, sorry, of Forest and Agricultural Sciences. Yes, I think I might have told that wrong. Anyway, at least there's some kind of, they put up a committee and they realize that this kind of issue hasn't been taken up. And they have this interest, at least for the forest owners and the different academics dealing with forestry issues to look into this topic. This committee is actually quite short-lived, but at least they come up with the idea that there's a big lacunas in this area, and we need more research, and we need to deal with it, and we actually need to set up a policy. So let's lobby for a new research program called Future Forest. And they, as long as they at least do some research, might come up with a solution and a policy and how to deal with this. There's so many question marks. Meanwhile, there's also the Swedish Forestry Agency that sets up a policy that includes this issue of climate adaptation. It's a climate policy, very internal climate policy. It's one of the few Swedish agencies that is informing about how to, how should I say this in English? It's one of the few agencies dealing with forestry issues exclusively in Sweden. So they take up at least this, they see that it's coming up and they take up this in their climate policy. But they still say we don't need to do anything at the moment. It's an issue that we are monitoring, but we don't need to do anything. But these kind of developments are going on. A storm is coming up in the southern Sweden, which had very dire consequences. And the debate is really coming up now. We need to do something because these kind of storms, we need to prepare for it. But the activities going around, if you look with hindsight, you see that there are quite just reactions to the actual storms. And there's a lot of talk about climate adaptation, but the reactions are actually just the reaction to the storm. And but the discussion develops, and as you can see, the previous graph, now the curve on climate adaptation issues and the debate is starting to grow. There's also the government orders a commission on climate and vulnerability, and this is also, of course, due to national developments, more on a national level due to floodings and so on. So it's not only related to forestry issues, but this kind of creates certain funding and opportunity for research and looking into the forestry sector and how to deal with climate adaptation. So this kind of also gets some attention and goes on. Another storm hits the forest. It has a less impact. But at least this keeps the debate going and the interest going. And then eventually, the research program that has been lobbied for by the Climate and Forestry Committee in early 2000 starts in 2009. And there we see also that actually focus and the agenda that is set for that research program to be only on climate adaptation is now much broader and not much more dispersed, probably due to the negotiation process that happens with funders and different interests, different researchers that want to get their stake into this program. Finally, as a result of the Climate and Vulnerability Commission and their urgency for more research and future action, the government also orders the Swedish Forest Agency to take some measures and start informing on climate adaptation as part of their information campaign to the forest owners. So there's at least some action more directed to climate adaptation from the government going on. But as you can see, there's still very much information and research oriented, a little bit hesitant, and it's also the development is also very much due to these storms and debates going on a national level. Yes, yes, please. Oh, go ahead.
I was thinking about the document from 2003 from the Swedish Forest Agency, Pro Research, No Action Needed. This is more an internal document?
Yes,
do you
it's an
agree?
internal forestry policy
Yes.
for the Swedish Forestry Agency.
Yes,
Yeah.
but that's sort of an important document for the development inside of the Swedish Forest Agency. But in 2005, they actually sent out a leaflet to forest owners with recommendations.
Yeah, yeah. At least I know there was a reaction to this Gudrun storm. There was a lot of more information going out, but I didn't know that this was...
No, it's a separate.
It's a separate, okay.
Yes, we have the report from the Gudrun storm, which is a
Yeah,
thick report,
yeah.
which is well, it's a thick report. But then you have a special report on climate adaptation, a small document.
Okay, okay.
2005.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I will look into that. Thank you. So, but looking at the overall developments and looking into these different actors coming up in this debate and their frames, we see that the network of the scientists, especially, that starts pushing up this, taking up this issue in the debate and start doing research on this and trying to get research funds for more climate adaptation research related to the forest sector. There are different people. There's not one that takes a lead. There's quite unorganized, yeah, there's not really a lobby going on there. There's no one taking up this issue I want to put on the agenda. And we also see generally that there's a quite little debate. There's not really people coming up and saying, no, we don't want any climate adaptation policy or so on. But this, of course, has to do also with the fact that it's a new issue. So the advocates being the researcher, and later also the Swedish Forest Agency comes in and starts informing and pushing up this issue. And with researchers, I mainly think of the climate-oriented researchers and from the Swedish Agricultural University. And we also see the environmental organizations commenting on this, but they don't take actively part in the debate, and they have a different perspective focusing on preserving biodiversity and very much this resilient argument that we need a biodiverse forest and let it be and very natural, while Swedish forestry is very much oriented towards production, so this is clashing quite a lot. And finally, we have if we can sum it all together, this forest industries organizations, they are very much hesitant. They're interested in looking at the progress and what is debated, but they say, wait and see, we have much more important issues. Mitigation, for instance, is important, because with they also use this kind of argumentation that mitigation is very... the forest industry commercial also is that if we produce forest products, we tie carbon into these products, and in this way we also contribute to mitigate climate change effects. So in that sense, this is also discourse that kind of suits their ends. And looking at the learning processes from this, we see that there are some learning, there are some debate coming up, there are some ideas and some policies coming up from the government, although very not very large ones, or that changes the general policy very much. And this is partly thanks to this advocacy coalition by selected researchers trying to push this issue and put this on the agenda. And it's also these kind of developments on national level that actually climate adaptation is taken up, and there is a commission on climate change and vulnerability looking into the forest sector and the vulnerabilities and the need to adapt. And of course, there's also these kind of storms that hit Sweden, and it's not only the forest sector, but there's also all the infrastructure around it. I mean, roads were blocked, electricity cuts there were electricity cuts for several days and so on. So the general public realized that this is what happens if a big storm is coming. But on the other hand, if I talk to some informants, this big storm, Gudrun, that everyone was discussing about, that this is something that really woke up my mind, that I need to do something if these kind of storms are coming in the future, it's also soon forgotten. Because, oh, sorry. I haven't been active enough. Anyway, so in that sense, it's soon forgotten in the sense that it hit the southern Sweden, at certain regions, and they have been preparing and they've been taking up these kind of measures and started thinking about climate adaptation in the future. But other regions that weren't harmed by this storm, they are also they've been much more laid back and, oh, this doesn't happen to me, and don't pay their insurances and so on. So we don't really know what effect this has in the long run. I will take my fake papers to be able to talk on the other aspect. Well, I was talking about, so these, you can see these kind of developments as some kind of growing opportunities for future climate adaptation policy. There is some movements creating space for these kind of debate and discussions and learning, although very weak. When looking at learning processes, it has actually been very limited and simple in the way if we analyze it. And that's, of course, because climate adaptation is very novel. It's a novel issue. It hasn't been discussed much. It's very uncertain. We don't really know what the effects are, and we cannot really plan ahead because, of course, there's a lot of physical effects, but how does that match with regional differences in the way different trees grow, or different lands and different local circumstances physically, and also more socially, and how we manage our forests in the future also affect how these trees grow and how the impact from climate change will be. So in that sense, it's very hard to plan. Secondly, this forestry practice in Sweden is very scientifically informed, yes, but they grow on case. I mean, this science is based on cases, is based on experience, and in that sense, this new science based on models and scenarios, it's very different way of making decisions and building policy on. So it's very hard for this forestry sector to deal with this kind of scientific evidence. And a third point is that one of the most powerful groups in society, this kind of forest industry, they are very resistant to policy change because they know if new policies come, their whole conditions of making business is of course changing. So they won't be very much informed. And now at the moment they are not very interested in climate adaptation, although they have a high production goal, is the production forest. So in that sense, you might think that they might be interested in kind of safeguarding their future production, but it seems at the moment that they are very much focused on more short-term goals and mitigation that kind of supports their way of cultivating and managing the forest at the moment. And finally, what we see, why this learning is kind of limited, is that there has been quite weak leadership, and there has been hardly any authority taking responsibility for this climate effect or climate adaptation issue. And then I say, okay, there's no authority, and then I think of this Swedish Forest Agency, for instance. They don't have the authority to put down their own a national policy. They had an internal policy for the agency of how to inform and so on, but it's always the national government authority that gives them orders of what to do. So in that sense, they don't really have the mandate to take on such a task, which is problematic. And you can see on leadership in a different sense. It's also the fact that there's no one coming up with this issue. Of course, there are some scientists that take up this issue of climate adaptation, but there's not one scientist or a leader or a kind of champion for this issue and saying that this is important, and lobby for it on a policy level and tries to get in and on the political agenda. In that sense, it's also a current barrier for learning. So by summing up, how does it go, Oscar? So this was more or less my final slide. And by looking at this, I mean, what I've been doing, by looking on these different learning processes and what kind of learning has been taking place, what kind of change has been taking place, and what kind of issues are posing barriers for learning, you also see what are the opportunities and barriers for policy change in this sector. Of course, it's a very slow computer. So to round up, I also have some brief kind of policy recommendation in case you want to, from a policymaker perspective, if you want to try to put climate adaptation on the agenda. I mean, this is how, depending on how, if you believe on the climate impact and if you want to do something about it, I think an important thing is to create time and space for these kind of learning processes. And at the moment we see there's a lot of focus on research, on scientific or expert advice to these forest owners. And that's fair. Of course, we have to put some facts on the table, but I believe at least there has been a lot of evidence from literature that, and we talked about it earlier also about bottom-up learning, and that there is also people at the local level that know about their own conditions and experience and what things matter and so on, which could be important. So create kind of space or arenas for these kind of dialogues and learning is one point. Another point is create some kind of if possible, or at least somebody take some lead or in this issue and tries to start advocating. So this was the slide that I talked about. And the final slide that I'm talking about now is how to deal with this. And so I mentioned time and space, creating arenas or space for learning. And the second is would be good if there is some kind of leadership or someone that advocates these kind of changes. It's easier if someone takes the lead to also follow and to see how to deal with it. And another idea would also be to widen the debate, and as it's been discussed today, because as you see, different people have different stakes, and we could try to make use of interest groups like the forest industry, for instance. Now they're not really interested in the debate, so what could we do to make them interested and contribute to this kind of development? One way would maybe be to not only focus on risk. At the moment it's only about diminishing risk, but for the forest sector they're of course very much interested in the opportunity and how to create even more growth. And we need to also adapt to kind of grasp these kind of opportunities, and then we might get them along in this kind of discussion. One other issue, of course, there's a lot, it's global effects, and we have been giving a lot of development aid since the 90s for climate adaptation in the south. And there's support for that, but we might also look at what happens, what's the consequences for the Swedish forest industry, if climate change happens globally, and what effect does it have for the industry, and how should we deal with it? And that might also maybe attract certain stakeholders into this debate and learn further about this issue. These are just some ideas, and I hope you could follow me despite the cut down of the system. Okay.
It's like the Swedish forest industry is as slow as Oscar's computer. No, a lot of very interesting points, I think, not least here in the end also. Talking about leadership, and it's so interesting that a sector that is so linked to climate, like forestry, that that there is no clear leadership even within the sector itself for these issues. As you say, it's more a wait and see mentality. Which I think is quite fascinating, I must say, that they don't seem to take and also the issue of opportunities, of course, is quite, it has been at least a bit sensitive in the climate change debate to even talk about opportunities from climate change, and I think maybe that is something that has maybe locked some thinking when it comes to looking at opportunities from climate change in a sector like forestry. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, at least what I've been hearing from when I've been at meetings and discussing with forest industry is that, yeah, well, we will, the growth of the trees will increase, the production will increase. Okay, we might have some risk, but I mean, that will even out. We don't need to worry. This is an issue that is not important, and I think this also ties to discussions earlier that, of course, climate effects are more dire in the south, so maybe we should prioritize doing something there, and that's what they've been saying, and say we can do mitigation because this works along with our plans. And but it seems like if we want to do something on climate adaptation in Sweden, we have to try to attract these kind of stakeholders to work along, because they are the people with the money, and they are the owners also of our forests. So I think it's important to try to also look from their perspective and mobilize in that sense.
Okay, so keep that on and speak loudly. Okay, we have one question there, one there, one there. Excellent. So we'll start here, please, and speak loudly.
Have you considered to what extent the risks that climate change is going to pose to the forest owners are actually own risks, perhaps just magnified? And if that is so, they have had to deal in the past 100 years with the risks of wildfires, forest fires, pests, and so on, and there actually are, in the forest management support already some sort of solutions for dealing with these things. You also mentioned the insurance, that people are not paying their premiums always. Maybe you could clarify on that. But what I'm kind of asking is, okay, there are forest sector precedents for dealing with pests, fires, things like that, and then there's the insurance coverage that already is available. So does climate change actually pose such a kind of radical departure from what already is there? Is the sector actually already prepared?
Yeah, you have a good point, and I mean we can't compare to the situation in the south again, but if I look at the storm Gudrun that hit Sweden in 2005, the Swedish government filed a request for funds from the EU for this damage, and it was a request for 20 billion Swedish crowns. So it was a reasonable damage, and the people that wasn't insured, they were there, and the Swedish government went in to help them. There was a lot of funds going in to kind of aid these people being stranded. So of course there's a mechanism there, and
maybe people knew that the government would come.
Yeah, maybe. That's a risk. I think that's a risk for the nation state in the end, because it taxpayers' money. But with the risks, there is a lot of risks today that you say that are targeted. The insects that we have today, we see them increase because of the warmer weather. We see the thaw in the land doesn't freeze as frequently anymore, so it's harder to do the logging in the winter and so on. The forest roads are breaking down and so on. So yes, there are old problems, but we also see risks of new pests and fungi and insects that are now prevalent in the south, and how that will affect our forests that haven't been hit by these pests before. We don't know. But there are some uncertainties there. So I think that is the things that we need to think about.
Excellent. So please, yes.
I have a series of questions. I'm trying to diminish it a bit. The first question about the insurance industries, that's a very interesting research topic, because there is a big literature on that would argue that adapt your insurance is already a form of adaptation, and then you're basically looking at interconnections between the insurance industry and the forest industry. And there's my question: are there any insurance companies in Sweden that are learning facilitators that have the manpower? Like I'm thinking right now, I just did field work down in Germany, and they have the Munich Re, which is the largest reinsurance company, and they have their strong research agenda, and they're pressing really hard on their policyholders. So is there something comparable in Sweden?
Sorry, Christina, did you want to comment on that?
I could comment on that as well, because the insurance is interesting. We have a comparatively high fraction of forest owners that do have insurance for wind damage. 40% in the storm-struck area of Gudrun had bought insurance. This is much higher than what you find in Germany, for instance, that previously was not available, that kind of insurances. But then we also need to consider the high fraction of private ownership in Sweden, as is the same in Germany, for instance. But the forest owners in Sweden, on average, only get 12% of their household income from their forestry. So they are not financially dependent on their forestry. This means that they have other reasons for owning a forest. So buying an insurance doesn't solve the problem. So, I mean, it wouldn't be... The problem would not go away by people 100% owning an insurance.
So you're making actually a comparison to what you talked about in Tanzania, that it's actually good if people do not have 100% dependence on a sector which is highly vulnerable to climate change, for instance. I mean, you say in Sweden it's only 12%. You said 12% of...
12% of the household income on average is from their own forestry.
And what else, if you look at average, what kind of other incomes do they normally have?
Probably they have a job, or they live in Stockholm and in the forest. It's very various times, but usually people have a job outside of the farms.
Just following up a question. We're talking about forestry holders, also owners, but we're not talking about the forest holdings, like the companies that actually appropriate the resource.
No, I'm talking about the privately owned, individual private forest owners.
Okay, but what's about the businesses, the forest holdings? Because they are more interested, but they're actually making a profit out of them. So I'm seeing them passing on right in my window every morning. So those are companies who are actually making the profit out of privately owned.
In the county of Kronoberg, where the Gudrun event happened, 80% of the forest land was owned by private individuals. So it's mainly private individuals that were struck by this event. Okay. But also we're talking about risk before, if I just come to that. It depends on the perspective. We were talking previously about the utilitarian perspective. From a national Swedish point of view, what was damaged during the Gudrun event was about 2 to 3% of the total standing volume in Sweden. 2 to 3%. That's very little. But if you ask a private individual forest owner about the risk of wind damage, that person is bound to say something different. And it's much bigger risk for the individual, because these persons, they're holding totally devastated, perhaps. I mean, it's a completely different picture than if you put it in a national context. Of course, there were other consequences of the storm, secondary consequences. People were out of electricity for up to 45 days. The main railroad between Stockholm and southern Sweden was blocked for 2 weeks. I mean, these are quite substantial things as well. So it depends on your perspective.
Actually, an interesting thing on the last point, of course, we talked about that's an adaptation issue, that you have to have wider areas between railroads and where the forest is, for instance. I mean, that was a typical sort of direct discussion. Probably nothing has been done after that, I would assume.
No, I don't
No.
think it's...
Like you say,
I get a telephone call about it, but I don't know if it's...
no, if something is implemented. It becomes, as you say, it becomes a discussion, and then it sort of dies out until the next time. Yes, please, you had a question.
Thanks, Johanna, for the very interesting presentation. I have a question. How exactly is adaptation defined in forestry? I was always thinking of adaptation to climate change so that you build or you grow trees so that they protect society from increased heat, which would then also be a mitigation measure at the same time. Maybe this influences also the way the media perceives the topics in the news.
There has been a really big debate about this mitigation issue, and of course that's actually the biggest argument used by the forest sector, that we grow trees to replace, for instance, products based on carbon, so replace plastic or very energy-intensive products, and in that sense we prevent climate change from happening, and it also takes up, of course, different climate gases and these kind of issues. But there is also a different idea of how to take up carbon, how to mitigate, how the forest is mitigating. One idea is that we let the forest stand in the forest, and thereby it takes up a lot of carbon, and it's really good. And the other idea is that, yes, it takes up the carbon when it grows, but only to a certain point, and then we have to use the forest product, so we have to cut it down and use the forest product to replace carbon-intensive products. So there's a debate going on about that also in Sweden. And when it comes to climate adaptation, it's more about, there is a lot of different definitions about what climate adaptation for whom, and so on. But here in the Swedish forest sector, it's also about how do we keep the industry going, for instance. How do we keep the forest producing and preventing this kind of storm damage or bugs that kind of damage the wood that we couldn't use it for certain products, and so on. Because it's such a big industry in the Swedish society, we're very dependent on it also for the Swedish economy to continue delivering and producing economic wealth, if I say it like that.
Can I ask one more on the slide with the graph?
Yeah.
Could you go back?
Oh, wrong direction.
The storm happened in 2005, right?
Yeah.
And the storm Per was
2007.
less costly, like 3.5 times less costly than the good one, unless you have
Yeah.
a huge deflection or something.
Yeah.
How can you explain the peak?
I think a debate usually in media usually comes after an event. So when it comes to, I mean, these are only speculations, and I want to do a qualitative analysis of these kind of articles as well. Otherwise, you can't actually say so much. But if the storm Gudrun was here, I mean, there was something going on, of course, previously also on climate adaptation. I mean, but if the storm Gudrun was in 2005, of course, there was a lot of media going on. Oh my God, there's something happening, and the replanting of these trees and the whole programs that followed these kind of building up the forest again continued in the years. And also there were other issues coming up, like the Commission and on vulnerability, on klimatsårbarhetskommission. How do you say? Climate and Vulnerability Commission that came up, that was put in place 2005, and they published a report in 2007, and that's also kind of took a lot of discussion. Hey, what will the government do with this? What's going on? And they made a sectoral analysis also of the forest sector and the vulnerabilities and the need for adaptation. So there's been a lot of different events also, I guess, contributing to this kind of publicity about forest and climate adaptation issues.
So do you think this peak is still completable and not recurring, so that the second peak will fall if you have a, I don't know.
I think the second peak in 2009 is maybe more as a reaction to the policy measures that came. For the Swedish Forest Agency got some support from the government to start informing about climate adaptation to different forest owners and practitioners in the field. So I think that is also more a policy measure that followed the Commission Commission report in 2007.
Do you want to comment directly on this?
Yeah, a comment on why there isn't any peak after 2005, but after 2007. And I believe, after talking to people, a lot of people, people didn't connect Gudrun to climate change, which is, of course, you can't be sure that it is connected at all. But when it happens twice in just a shorter period of time, sort of the memory of Gudrun is still there, and the second time there is a reaction, which is bigger than the first time.
Yeah,
that is my impression.
Good point. Yeah.
That's why we always have to order at least 2 catastrophes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Fool me once, blame you. Fool me twice.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that I think the peak following 2005 is probably through the accession of Poland and Ukraine and Eastern Europe, because that poses additional competition on the Swedish market. And then
sorry, what did you say there? There's an accession of
peak in just in articles about forest and production are probably related to wider, like global or EU-wide economic policies, like the accession of Poland and the Czech Republic and other Eastern European states that pose other competition. And then I think the ones that are related to climate change are probably they are right in the context of signing the Kyoto Protocol, Bali. So I think it's not very fruitful just to base that kind of a quantitative analysis on domestic factors.
Yeah, true. You have to look internationally.
The forest industry here is very much aware that it's completely dependent on the national and international market.
Yeah,
it's a wider context.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, the big peak on production is probably related to the change in the politics, where it's much stronger focus again on production was sort of
on
declared.
this mitigation.
And that's,
Okay. Any other questions on this? On the presentation? Okay. What I would like to propose is, again, an applaud to you for making this excellent presentation. And before maybe leaving to Oscar also, I mean, it doesn't really matter. When the weather is like this, we can always end a bit early. In the winter, it doesn't really matter. What else can you do than to have nice seminars and so on? But before we do that, Oscar, maybe if anyone has any general question or comment or anything on the discussions we've had, I mean, please feel free to get that out before I hand over to Oscar for some finalizing words. Anything? Yes, please.
Yes, so it was very interesting.
You can take that.
And it was a lot of issue about challenge of governing climate change adaptation at all the conditions. It has to be a lot of participatory from the people that are involved in order to have success. It has to be it has to be legitimate. It's important that it's just also, but I think there is one issue that is I missed a lot. It was transparency. You have to monitor the system and to give access to information for the people, and not least when it is a very complicated pattern, this climate finance with the green climate fund and so on. So transparency issue is I think it's very interesting too.
Yeah, I think you partly touched upon it, but I mean, do you want to comment on that? Because it's also linked to what you discussed very much, I guess, both in particular when it comes to, I hate that word, legitimacy. You have to say it very slowly.
Yeah, I think in the UNFCCC negotiations, the developing countries were very clever when they argued for the MRV concept to be applied also on the flows of adaptation. So the MRV is sort of the lingua in the negotiations for transparency. I mean, to have it measurable and reportable and verifiable. So what we will see is that we will have those criteria coming to be sort of that we will measure and have targets and to follow up the flows of finance that goes through. So it's just transparency is certainly sort of in their negotiations, although it's not necessarily framed as transparency that political science would like to frame it, but as sort of the MRV discourse.
Thank you. Well, transparency, as we also said in the beginning, Transparency International then focusing at least on corruption as, yes, it's wider than that. Yes, no, you're right. And it is a very interesting subject, of course. How do you ensure transparency? What is transparency, really? Any other comments, general comments? Yes, please.
I've thought about what the forest initiative was really stick for mine was the notion that there's no leadership within the scientific community or the businesses, etc. So that, of course, answers the question, okay, maybe we should embrace each other more and work more closely with each other. And then, of course, that kind of entails compromises that you necessarily make. And there's a general question that if we really want to put adaptation into actually on the ground, there is a big requirement for enhanced collaboration with businesses, with insurance companies especially, and with natural resource, part of the economy that based on natural resources. And usually the scientific community has done with that with high reservations, trying to maintain subjectivity on the expenses of applicability probably. I think that is a general moral question, what we're going to do about that.
A number of excellent points, and it's good to bring up a lot of issues that we need to look at more, of course, in the future. We haven't talked about microinsurances, for instance, also, which is, of course, an interesting concept, not least in many developing countries, and how you develop them in a practical way. Okay, any other comments, or are you all longing for the sun outside? Getting there. Maybe, Oscar, I would like to hand over to you, because you will have the pleasure of sort of trying to summarize a little bit and give some directions maybe, and some final words and a launching and, well, all these kind of things.
With the practicalities. There is a list of participants here that everybody should preferably add their name to. It's good
Here.
for statistics. In order to secure funding in the next phase of this program, we have to show that people turn up for our seminars. So those of you who have not added your names to this list, please raise your hands. Nobody? I'll hand it over to Pelle then, who's program secretary. Oh, sorry. All right. So this is something that is normally done by our program director. He's really good at wrapping things up and saying clever things. Anyway, so I'll do two things. I'll conclude, make some small concluding remarks, and I'll make a bit of promotion for something that we've just finished. I think this has been a very good day, very exciting, very interesting. This is clearly an emerging field. It's interesting to sort of follow this this discourse for a while. It used to be, the adaptation used to be a matter for climate scientists, primarily modelers, saying, we see impacts, probably somebody should do something about dealing with them. And it's now certainly moved into a matter for many disciplines. We see, obviously, political scientists, environmental justice, a whole range of different disciplines approaching this field from their own sort of direction. It's really quite interesting when you meet and discuss a common problem from these very different perspectives. And I would say climate adaptation is both important, particularly when you look at the sort of numbers of the sort of money that is now suddenly on the table, and also the kind of impacts that you could expect. But it's also very difficult, because you have to use a lot of sort of established concepts and apply them to this fairly new problem, and the time perspectives don't really make
things easier. So we're sort of in a, I think we're in a growth business, if you see what I mean. In the first presentation today by Dr. Pavela, I think it's interesting to see how local action is sort of linked to the national context, both in terms of the context in which people work in all different kinds of all different aspects. And even though all action is local, I mean, all adaptation is local, that's sort of a catchphrase, it also matters sort of in what society you're acting. And I think over time, what could be seen as adaptation is actually just adjusting to conditions. I mean, we've adapted to globalization by simply stopping doing certain things, shutting down certain industries. And maybe not at the time, it was not packaged as, well, this is adaptation to a difference, to globalization. But in hindsight, we can say, well, the Swedish economy adapted to globalization by not manufacturing certain things anymore. So maybe some of the adaptation needed will actually not be neither packaged nor presented as or felt as adaptation as such. It'll just be something that people do. And then in hindsight, we will say, well, people have increased their abilities to deal with climate variability. And in the second presentation, we got a very interesting sort of theoretical discussion on these practicalities. You know, how do you design solutions that are both just and legitimate? Because in the end, it matters. If people feel that a certain solution is good, based on these concepts, it's more likely to succeed than not. So I think that we need to see more of that. And I'm very happy that Johannes could join us today, because it's really an important balance to all the sort of model-driven discussions that we've seen previously. And finally, Johanna has illustrated, I think, the importance of the time perspective. These change processes take time. I mean, this is obviously something that was the discussion started in Sweden 15, 20 years ago, and still to date we have seen we've seen some action, but there's certainly no sort of coherent forest sector strategy in place. And I think it's important to know the historical context when you try to design solutions for the future. So all three, I think, presentations today were excellent, and they really shed light on this issue from very different perspectives. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to switch to I'm going to put on my promotion hat, because part of the work that we've done in Mistra-SWECIA has, together with other work, materialized in a report that is not printed. It's going to be printed any day, but today we have a fact sheet that you will all, a policy brief that you'll all get, and it's about linking, it's about dialogues between local practitioners and policymakers, and it's sort of a do's and don'ts list based on our work. So how do you link, or how do you learn from what's happening on the ground when you design adaptation policy in a regional or national context? It's really exciting work, and it's actually packaged as a SEI research report, which is sort of the best in terms of quality that we produce. It's peer-reviewed, etc. It's really a good report, but as a teaser, you get this policy brief with you when you leave today. And finally, I would like to thank Johanna Pavela, Johannes Striple, and Johanna Ullmanen for coming here, for taking the time to present, preparing and participating in the discussions. And we have a habit of running these SWECIA Science seminars on Fridays, so the standard thing is always say, well, have a good weekend. I can't do that today, but I'm going to do it anyway. So when the weekend comes, have a good one, okay? Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to collaborating with you more. Mistra-SWECIA is now wrapping up. This is the last year of the first phase. We are optimistic that will be a second phase starting next year, so you will hear more from us. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming to SAI, and see you soon again.
Ja, absolut.